Hey everyone, it's Valk9 Designs. We're back for the Hybrid 2.0 series. This is part 2 where we build the frame. Jumping right into it, we're going to be taking a strip of bezel. This is a pretty tall strip of bezel. I will leave some just basic bezel links from Rio Grande for you in the comments. You're going to need to use a bezel that is appropriate to the size of your stone. Once you shape the bezel all the way around your stone, you just want to make sure that the bezel is around a millimeter above the stone, so that way you can set the stone into your bezel setting securely. I'm right now just folding the angles that I need to make the corners for this setting. Once I get everything all nice and even where I want it, make sure the stone fits in there, make sure your angles are correct so that way your bezel is as flush to the stone as possible. Checking the side, it's just about a millimeter over the stone, and so that's perfect for setting over that angled edge that you see on this I don't really want to call it a faceted stone, it's kind of like a free-form cabochon, but yeah. So here we are attaching this bezel to the silver sheet that I'm using for this piece. I'm using a 24 gauge sheet, pretty thin. You know, I don't need much of it here, I just need a thin piece of silver on the back to add a nice setting for that Super 7 cabochon. As I'm heating the whole piece of silver up, I'm moving my flame all the way around. You don't want to hold the heat in one section for too long. You want the whole piece to be heated up, because when you're heating silver, the heat is going to go to the coldest section of the piece first, so you want the whole thing to be nice and have an even heat, so you can let your solder fuse between the bezel and the sheet silver. Starting to see some good flow on my solder there. And then once I get that all the way around, I'm ready to take that over to my bench anvil and cut off the extra sheet, so that way I can put that in the scrap bin or use it for other projects, whatever ends up being done with it. Right now I'm just marking off some edges with the Sharpie, so that way I can make sure I don't go too far in when I file this down. I just want a nice even edge there, and I also want the sheet silver to cover the back of the stone. And so once I've gotten all of my edges marked where I want to cut, this is just kind of to help me so that way mid-cut I'm not like losing focus. It's just something I do. You don't have to mark your edges. We're ready to take your saw and start cutting off the edges of this frame that we don't need on here. And I'm using a number 2 saw blade. Number 2 is the grit of saw. I can't really, I don't know the exact formulation of explaining that, but it has to do with however many saw tooths there are within a certain, length. And so the number 2 is the best for cutting silver. I have drilled a hole through the center of this setting so that way I can feed my saw blade through and then cut out the inner section of this setting, so that way light can be allowed through this setting to illuminate the stone. Again, you don't really need much of an edge around your silver bezel setting here. You just need enough of an edge to hold the stone so that way it doesn't fall out of the back once you push down the bezel around the stone. Use a up and down motion, applying very, very light pressure forward. Sawing silver is not about applying pressure, it's about the motion of the saw blade. If you apply too much pressure, you're going to break your saw blades because, they're not very thick. You have to use small saws when you're sawing these finer pieces. Once you remove that center section, you're now ready to file down the inner part of the setting. Again, you're only going to need about a millimeter, maybe 2 millimeters. I think I left around like 2.5, 3 millimeters on my edging here. Since the stone is translucent, you don't want to leave a huge edge, otherwise it's just going to kind of look weird on the outside of the stone when you look through it. So now I'm filing down my outside. These are number 2 files. I will leave some Rio item numbers in the description for you all, so that way you can find the files that work for you. The number 2, again, is recommended for shaping and like kind of, filing down big portions of the silver. And then when you get into the finer grits like the number 3 and the number 4, those are more for finer details, so that way you're not removing as much silver with each stroke. It's for fine detail shaping, but right now I'm using the number 2 to remove as much material as possible. So that stone looks pretty good. The edge might need to come down just a little bit more, so I'm going to remove the edge on that right side just a tad bit more because it's a little thick. But yeah, you just want to leave a thin edge so that way when the light shines through, you're not seeing, an ungodly amount of silver backing the stone, kind of blocking the light. Shaping up some tubes here. This is the 2.54 millimeter tube that I'm using to set 2 2mm stones in the bottom of this piece. Once I've got a long enough section of tube, I'm ready to fuse them to the frame, and yeah, we're getting pretty close to building the whole frame here. We've got our stone settings. Now we're ready to build our wire settings. So back on our drawing, I'm using a pen to mark out the shape of wire that I need to make the frame here for our hybrid design. I'm going to be using Argentium silver 18 gauge half hard to build this frame. I just like to pre-mark out everything so that way I know where I need my supports and what I'm planning on doing for my frame, making sure that all fits nicely, and it looks like we are good to go. Back over at our soldering station, we are ready to start shaping up the outer frame for this piece, taking that length of 18 gauge Argentium. Again, I'm using half hard for this. Dead soft is just not preferred for myself for building frames. I prefer sturdiness in the frame, so the half hard kind of already allows some of that strength. You can always, of course, anneal it, and I, of course, anneal my frames to make them a little bit more sturdy, but the half hard just kind of already gets you halfway there. So we're attaching this frame to our stone setting. I'm going to clip off our extra and make sure everything sits together how we want it to on the design. Everything looks good to go. I'm adding a support across the top part there, just so that way I can add another section of fused frame so the top part of this stone setting does not get pushed down once I ultimately end up, pushing the bezel around the stone. So now I'm using, this is medium solder. I used medium solder for the bezel as well. Medium solder is what I use for all of my framework. Hard seems to be a little too high of a melting point for the thinner gauges of silver. If you're building a huge body of a piece, like, with a lot of different sheet silver elements, I believe hard solder is not a bad option. But for these thinner wire elements, you're going to want to go with medium and then easy solder for the final components. I'm using medium solder for this final bracing up here that I'm putting near the top. The bail will attach up at this pointed area as we talked about when I was designing this piece in the last video. I'm adding another little corner of wire up at the top just to give it some extra sturdiness there and a bit more rigidity, so that way when I add the bail there, there's, a bit more silver for it to hang from. Soldering on the tubes. This I used easy solder for, just so that way the bezel wasn't shifting and the solder for the bezel wasn't, coming apart and off of the frame. So now that we've got the main base of the frame built, we're ready to move on to the bail. This is a section of 2x1 rectangular wire. I've just opened it up and put it around that triangular section, and using my pliers I'm closing it up and trying to get everything aligned so that way I can solder it together and allow it to act as a nice sturdy kind of dangle bail just to give the piece a little bit of motion. I'm going to end up needing to clean up the end of that bail just because it's a little too pointy and restricted the motion at first, but I'm going to be filing that down in the next section when we clean this up and get into the stone setting of this piece. But as you can see, that's it cleaned up a little bit. That allows the motion, it allows the pendant to swing a little bit, but I was not happy with how it was scraping still, so I'm going to end up filing that down and shaping it in the next video. So this is the build of the hybrid frame. When you're building, your wire tie-down points, either you need to drill holes through sheet or you need to build up a frame onto your stone settings to add the wire to the piece. And as you can see, it's all secure, ready to rock and roll. And in the next video, we will clean this up and then set the stones. Thank you all so much. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you to all my Patreon supporters, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you got this 6 months after my Patreon supporters, so consider checking out my Patreon channel to access more tutorials. Have a wonderful day.